Who made this dish? Billionaire asks. The black maid who made it shocked everyone. What if the most powerful man in the city discovered that the woman who'd been quietly cleaning his mansion for 20 years held the key to his most precious childhood memory? Richard Whitmore had everything money could buy: a sprawling estate overlooking the harbor, art collections worth millions, and a business empire that stretched across 3 continents. But tonight, as he sat alone in his grand dining room, staring at an empty plate that had just held the most incredible meal he'd tasted in decades, none of that mattered. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone to call the kitchen. The dish had transported him back 40 years, to a tiny apartment where his grandmother's hands worked magic with simple ingredients. The flavors were identical, impossibly, perfectly identical. "Maria," he called out, his voice carrying a note his staff had never heard before. "Could you please come here?" As the soft footsteps approached from the kitchen, Richard felt his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with business deals or board meetings. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Maria Santos had been working in the Whitmore mansion since she was 28, arriving each morning at 6 sharp with her quiet dignity and gentle smile. She'd watched Richard transform from a driven young businessman into one of the city's most influential figures, always maintaining the same respectful distance between employer and employee. Tonight felt different, though. She'd prepared his dinner as usual, a simple braised chicken dish her own grandmother had taught her back in Louisiana, never expecting it would cause such a reaction. "Mr. Whitmore?" Maria appeared in the doorway, smoothing her apron nervously. She'd seen him angry before, frustrated over failed deals, but this expression was something else entirely. His usually composed face showed a vulnerability she'd never witnessed. "Please sit down," Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Maria hesitated. In 20 years, she'd never sat at his table. "Please," he repeated, softer this time. "Is everything all right, sir? Was the chicken not to your liking?" Richard laughed, but it came out shaky. "Maria, that chicken was." He paused, searching for words. "Where did you learn to make it exactly like that?" "My grandmother taught me when I was just a little girl. It's been in our family for generations." Maria's voice carried the warmth of memory. She learned it from her grandmother, who learned it from hers. Something in Richard's chest tightened. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet the taste didn't lie. "Maria, what was your grandmother's name?" "Ruth. Ruth Washington. Though most folks called her Miss Ruthie." Maria smiled at the memory. She was quite a woman, worked for many families throughout her life, always cooking with love. The color drained from Richard's face. Miss Ruthie. The woman who'd lived in the apartment below his grandmother's, who'd become like family during the hardest years of his childhood. But that would mean... "Miss Ruthie," Richard whispered, the name carrying decades of buried emotion. "She had the most beautiful singing voice." Maria's eyes widened. "You knew my grandmother?" "I lived upstairs from her," Richard said, his voice barely audible. "When I was 7 years old, after my parents died, I stayed with my grandmother in that little apartment on Riverside Street." "Miss Ruthie." His voice caught. "She saved my life." The weight of recognition settled between them like a bridge spanning 40 years. Maria's hand flew to her mouth as memories of her grandmother's stories suddenly took on new meaning. The little white boy upstairs who'd lost his parents. The child her grandmother would sneak extra food to when his own grandmother struggled to make ends meet. "You're little Richie," Maria breathed. "Grandmother used to tell me about you. She said you were the smartest, bravest little boy she'd ever met. Said you used to sit on her kitchen floor while she cooked, asking her a million questions about everything." Richard's composure finally cracked. Tears he'd held back for decades began to fall. "She taught me more than anyone else ever did. About kindness, about treating people with dignity regardless of their station in life. When I got sick that winter, she sat by my bedside for 3 days straight." "She never forgot you," Maria said gently. "Even when I was grown, she'd wonder what became of little Richie. She'd say, 'That boy's got something special in him. Mark my words, He's going to change the world someday. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here was Richard, who indeed had changed the world in his way, employing the granddaughter of the woman who'd shaped his character. And yet, for 20 years, they'd existed in the same house without knowing their shared history. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Maria, Richard said, wiping his eyes, there's something I need to tell you about why your grandmother meant so much to me. The night before I left for college, Richard continued, his voice heavy with emotion, Miss Ruthie gave me an envelope. She made me promise not to open it until I really needed it. He stood slowly, walking to the antique desk by the window. I've carried it with me for 40 years, through every triumph and failure. Maria watched as he retrieved a yellowed envelope from a locked drawer, her grandmother's careful handwriting still legible on the front. For little Richie, when you're all grown up and need reminding. I've been too afraid to open it, Richard admitted, returning to the table. Afraid it wouldn't live up to the memory, or that it would break something precious inside me. Maria understood that fear. Grandmother always said the most important gifts are the ones that wait for the right moment. With trembling hands, Richard finally broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small, faded photograph. The picture showed a young Richard sitting in Miss Ruthie's kitchen, flour in his hair, helping her roll out biscuits. On the back, in her careful script, every kindness you show someone else is a prayer that comes back to you. The letter was brief but powerful. Dear Richie, by the time you read this, you'll probably be a man with more success than this old woman could imagine. But I hope you remember that success isn't what you accumulate, it's what you give away. You have a gentle heart, child. Don't let the world harden it. And remember, family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who choose to love you. Love always, Miss Ruthie. Richard's hands shook as he set the letter down. For decades, he'd built an empire but had isolated himself in the process. He'd forgotten the most important lesson Miss Ruthie had tried to teach him. Maria, he said, his voice breaking, I've been so focused on building something great that I forgot to actually live. I've been living in the same house as family for 20 years and didn't even know it. Maria reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. Grandmother used to say that God has a way of bringing people back together when they need each other most. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Richard looked at Maria with new eyes, not as an employee, but as the granddaughter of the woman who'd saved him, as family he'd unknowingly found again. The question was, after 40 years of living in different worlds, could they bridge the gap that class and time had created between them? Maria, Richard said, still holding the letter, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. He took a deep breath. Are you happy here? Really happy? Maria considered the question carefully. I've been grateful for this job, Mr. Whitmore. It's provided for my family, put my daughter through college. But... She paused, weighing her words. I won't lie to you. Sometimes I feel invisible. Like I'm just part of the furniture. The honesty hit Richard like a physical blow. I'm sorry, he said, and the apology carried the weight of 20 years. I'm so sorry, Maria. I became exactly the kind of person your grandmother hoped I'd never become. Someone who forgot that every person matters. She wouldn't want you to carry guilt, Maria said softly. She'd want you to do better going forward. Richard stood up suddenly, his business mind finally aligned with his heart. Then that's exactly what we're going to do. He began pacing, the energy that had built his empire now channeled toward something far more important. Maria, do you remember your grandmother's dream? The one she used to talk about. Maria's eyes lit up with surprise. You remember that? She wanted to open a restaurant where people from all walks of life could come together over good food. Where a businessman could sit next to a construction worker, where food would be the great equalizer. Richard's voice grew stronger with each word. What if we made that dream come true? Mr. Whitmore, I couldn't possibly. Richard, he corrected gently. And yes, you could. We could. as partners. He pulled out his phone and began dialing. I'm calling my lawyer right now. We're going to start a foundation in Miss Ruthie's name, and you're going to run it. We'll open not just one restaurant, but a whole network of community kitchens where everyone is welcome. Maria stared at him in disbelief. Are you serious? I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Richard paused as his lawyer answered. James? I need you to draft partnership papers immediately. Yes, tonight. He looked at Maria. And I want you to draw up documents changing the ownership structure of my estate. I want to ensure that Maria Santos and her family are taken care of for generations. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. As Richard made call after call, transforming his grandmother's memory and Miss Ruthie's dream into reality, Maria felt tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of joy, of vindication for a woman who'd spent her life believing in the power of kindness to change the world. The little boy Miss Ruthie had loved was finally coming home. 6 months later, the first Miss Ruthie's Community Kitchen opened its doors in the same neighborhood where Richard and Maria's grandmothers had lived. The restaurant buzzed with life. Teenagers from the local high school sat next to retired teachers, construction workers shared tables with office managers, and everyone paid what they could afford. Above the kitchen door hung the photograph of young Richard and Miss Ruthie making biscuits together, with her handwritten words below it. Every kindness you show someone else is a prayer that comes back to you. Richard arrived each morning at 8, not to oversee operations, but to work alongside Maria in the kitchen. His hands, once soft from a life of luxury, now bore the honest calluses of daily food preparation. He'd discovered something his billions couldn't buy: the joy of serving others with purpose. Grandmother would be so proud, Maria said one morning as they watched a young mother teach her son to set tables alongside a retired businessman who volunteered every Tuesday. She'd be proud of both of us, Richard replied, then paused. Maria, I have something for you. He handed her a small wrapped package. Inside was a simple wooden spoon, worn smooth from decades of use. This was Miss Ruthie's, Maria whispered, recognizing it immediately. I saved it from her kitchen after she passed. I always meant to find a way to get it to her family, but I was too young and foolish to know how. Richard's voice was gentle. It belongs with you now. Maria held the spoon to her heart, feeling the connection across generations. You know what she'd say if she could see us now? What's that? She'd say that the best recipes aren't the ones written down in books. They're the ones written on our hearts and passed down through love. Richard nodded, understanding finally settling into his soul. He'd spent 40 years trying to build a legacy through money and power, only to discover that the greatest legacy was already his: the love and wisdom of a woman who'd seen potential in a broken little boy and chose to nurture it. As the lunch rush began and the community kitchen filled with laughter and conversation, Richard and Maria worked side by side, continuing the recipe Miss Ruthie had started so many years ago: 1 part kindness, 1 part dignity, and a generous helping of love for everyone who walked through their doors. The boy who'd lost everything had finally found his way home, and the woman who'd spent her life serving others had discovered her true calling. Sometimes the most beautiful stories aren't about what we achieve, but about what we remember, what we honor, and who we choose to become when we finally understand what really matters. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales like this one. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery, family, and the power of kindness to transform lives across generations.